Finally, a peace encyclical. Human rights, arms control, the UN, international law, economic development. Until this point in history, the church had been an inward-looking, encrusted hierarchy. Now it has woken up. So runs a prominent interpretation of Pacem and Terris, the famous encyclical of John the 23rd, who, on this interpretation, is the peace pope. This interpretation, however, exaggerates the novelty of Pacem and Terris and discounts the continuity in the magisterium's teaching. For over 40 years earlier, Benedict XV, the Pope during World War I, sounded little different than President Woodrow Wilson in his advocacy of a new international organization, international law, and arms control in the wake of the Great War. He even added a twist that Wilson did not, commending forgiveness to the great powers of Europe, a teaching they ignored. Leo XIII had spoken of the scourge of war in the late 19th century. Popes Pius XI and Pius XII spoke similarly. Pacem and Terris was far from the first instance in which the church had taught human rights either. Bartolomé de las Casas and the Spanish scholastics defended the human rights of native peoples in the Americas in the 16th century, as Paulo Carrozza has written about, and John Whitty referred to earlier. Pope Leo XIII had defended rights in his foundational encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891. Still, if Pacem and Terris was not the church's first authoritative articulation of peace and human rights, it still deserves landmark status. Certainly not going to throw cold water on that at the end of this conference on Pacem and Terris. Never before had the church offered such a concentrated and forceful statement of these themes. Human rights are especially prominent, asserted in the first section after the introduction. The word rights occurs 77 times in the encyclical. That's about as close as I get to quantitative analysis. Of course, Pacem and Terris takes place in the wake of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the embrace of rights in Enlightenment thought in the 18th century. But Pacem and Terris should not be seen as catch-up ball. Not only did the Catholic tradition espouse human rights far earlier than the Enlightenment or the Universal Declaration, but it provided its own basis for human rights, the image of God residing in every person and natural law. For reasons that are not the subject of my talk today, I find the Church's grounding of human rights far more promising than the Enlightenment's justifications rooted in self-interest, security, and autonomy. Pacem and Terris is also notable for what is, I believe, the Church's articulation of one human right in particular, religious freedom, or as the encyclical puts it in paragraph 14, the right to worship God according to one's conscience. This novelty is often overlooked and overshadowed by Dignitatis Humanae, the 1965 encyclical devoted to religious freedom, but it is there. The Church continued to articulate human rights and make them central to its social teaching long after Pacem and Terris. Pope John Paul II resounded Pacem and Terris when he called the modern human rights movement an awakening of conscience. The Church's embrace of human rights and its call for regimes to be accountable to human rights in Pacem and Terris, as well as in other documents of the Second Vatican Council like Gaudium et Spes and Dignitatis Humanae, was of great historical consequence. Here I'm going to build on some things that Alan Hersky said. As he mentioned, one of the great global trends of the past generation has been what political scientists call the third wave of democratization. Estimates differ, but arguably some 90 countries, almost half of the world's states, have either become democracies or made serious progress towards democracy in the past 40, 50 years. What most political scientists have overlooked, and what still is a very secular field, is the striking role of religion in the third wave. My colleagues and I, in our book, God's Century, looked at 78 cases of democratization and found that in 48 of these cases, religious leaders and communities played an instrumental role in bringing about democracy. Even more strikingly, in 36 of these cases, this religious community was the Catholic Church. Again, echoing Alan, the late Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington was exceptional for noticing this trend, which he called the Catholic wave. Many of us, at least those as old as I, will recall historical images from the Catholic wave. We think of John Paul II in Poland, as was flashed up on the screen earlier today. Think also of the Philippines and those images of nuns staring down tanks in the people power revolution against the dictator Ferdinand Marcos. The church played a heroic role in opposing the dictatorship of Pinochet in Chile, where it also appealed to human rights. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Vatican's teaching of human rights brought national churches in Spain and Portugal to come to depart from their historical partnership with authoritarian governments and take up oppositional stances, in both cases leading to democratization. In many other countries, too, the church was instrumental in overthrowing dictators and or promoting democracy. Lithuania, Brazil, El Salvador, Guatemala, Timor-Leste, South Korea, Malawi, South Africa, Sudan, and the Ukraine. What explains why these national churches became effective democratizers? In good part, the impact of Pacem and Terris and related council documents. Once these were promulgated, these teachings spread through the global church via the church's bishops. To be sure, not everywhere did the church side with democracy. We talked about this ambivalence before. In Argentina, the bishops were comparatively cozy with that country's dictatorship during the Dirty War, although there were some heroic exceptions. It's never one thing or the other. This collaboration, of course, came up in media investigations of the past of our new Pope Francis, although he has happily been largely exonerated. Rwanda is another good example of a country where the Catholic Church was passive towards dictatorship, in this case, one that had committed genocide. Generally, what characterizes those national Catholic churches that actively oppose dictatorships from those that remain passive or were complicit is that they manifested a strong degree of independence in their authority from the regimes that they opposed, and they accepted the Council's teaching on human rights widely in their ranks. Again, Pacem in Terris is pivotal. In addition to democratization, the mediation of peace agreements is an area in which the church has exercised an influence for peace and human rights in the decades since Pacem in Terris. One of the leaders here is surely the community of San Egidio, who, drawing on a deep network of friendships in Mozambique, negotiated an end to a civil war there that had lasted a decade and a half and taken the lives of 1.6 million people. In 1992, the community hosted 9 rounds of peace negotiations at its headquarters in Rome's Trastevere neighborhood. Subsequently, the community helped to negotiate peace agreements, though not always successfully, in Algeria, Kosovo, Uganda, Burundi, Liberia, Guatemala, and elsewhere. One of the great prelates for peace in the church is Archbishop John Baptist Odama of Uganda, whom Todd Whitmore, I don't know if he's still here, has done so much to bring his story to be public, who formed a coalition of religious leaders who paved the way for and helped to conduct peace negotiations in that country's civil war, which took 300,000 lives. Most courageously, Odama traipsed through the bush for several days to meet with the leader of the rebel Lord's Resistance Army, Joseph Kony, which ignited peace negotiations in the mid-2000s. Other examples of church mediation include El Salvador, Congo, Ivory Coast, Nicaragua, Timor-Leste, and the Beagle Channel dispute, which the Vatican mediated between Argentina and Chile in the late 1970s. All of this would be nearly impossible to imagine were it not for Pacem in Terris and the cousin declarations that followed close in its wake. So Pacem in Terris endures. But what if Pope Francis were to pen another peace encyclical today? Somebody over here had called for a new flag. What would that look like? How would it be different? What themes would it retain? Surely human rights, international law, cooperation among nations, and economic development, persistent as they are in Catholic social thought, would appear. But I want to argue that rights, law, and even development are not enough. Today's conflicts look different than they did in Pope John the 23rd's time, as the professor has done so much to explain in that last illuminating talk. Most of the world's nastiest wars since Pacem in Terris have taken place within states, sometimes spilling over into regions, but not between states. There have been a few. But think only of Cambodia, Rwanda, Sudan, Yugoslavia, and Syria. And it is now civilians, not combatants, who suffer the overwhelming proportion of death in war, the reverse of the situation in the first half of the 20th century. So too, peace-building efforts look different than they did in Pope John XXIII's era. Certainly some of them place great emphasis upon human rights and the rule of law. Since the end of the Cold War, there has been an explosion of UN peacekeeping operations. The International Criminal Court embodies the dream of human rights activists and international lawyers that arch war criminals would be held accountable, the dream of Nuremberg. Refugee resettlement, humanitarian aid and intervention, and election monitoring fall in the same category based on rights and the rule of law. But the past generation has also seen an explosion of new practices and institutions for building peace, many of which address the past injustices or the injustices of the past for trying to build a stable future. Over 40 truth commissions have arisen, all tasked with telling the truth publicly about past crimes. Of course, Pepe Zalaquet is a living embodiment of those experiences. Reparation settlements have proliferated across the globe. Traditional tribal mechanisms for reintegrating wrongdoers are being drawn upon and adapted to context of modern political violence. Amnesties have become quite common, which are legal in character, but crucially involve the cancellation of what the rule of law otherwise demands. It has become far more common for political leaders to issue public apologies. Forgiveness has entered global politics. Museums, memorials, and rituals of remembrance have proliferated. A frequent challenge is to find a way to end cycles of revenge and fear between ethnic, national, and religious groups. Nor are these challenges foreign to American foreign policy. They have been central in Iraq and Afghanistan, and were as well in Somalia and Kosovo. What is needed is a wider, more encompassing concept of justice and peace than is found in Pacem and Terris, one that would surely encompass human rights and the rule of law, but that also extends much wider than them. In recent years, such a concept has indeed arisen in church teachings, although it takes some looking to find it. It goes by the name of reconciliation. The core meaning of the concept is a holistic restoration of right relationship. As with human rights in Pacem and Terris, reconciliation is not entirely new in church teaching. It is central, of course, in the New Testament, where the Apostle Paul uses it to describe God's salvation of the world through Christ. Its deployment in a political context can be traced back to Pope Benedict XV, who, as I mentioned earlier, advocated reconciliation and forgiveness at the end of World War I. It was Pope John Paul II who took up the concept again in his 1980 encyclical Divis in Misericordia, or Rich in Mercy, in the final section of which he commended reconciliation and forgiveness in the practice of politics. Repeats the same claim in subsequent addresses for the World Day of Peace, especially in 1997 and then in 2002, dramatically after the September 11th attacks. Pope Benedict XVI commended reconciliation for politics as well. After he became Pope, we may forget this, but he explained that he had chosen his name in part to honor Benedict XV and his message of reconciliation, as well as Benedict of Nursia as well, too. He later invoked reconciliation with regard to the 2006 war in Lebanon, his policy towards China, his World Day of Peace message on religious freedom, and his post-synodal exhortation on Africa. The latter, known as Africae Munis, makes reconciliation the pivotal concept for peace and justice in Africa. Reconciliation can be heard on the ground in global politics, too. Many of the world's truth commissions are named Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and are guided by a theme of reconciliation. One even finds it in American foreign policy circles. For instance, the report of the Iraq Study Group, a high-level group of foreign policy experts commissioned in 2006 during the depths of the civil war in Iraq, uses the term reconciliation 63 times. With my remaining time, I'd like to offer some thoughts on the Church's teaching that reconciliation is a principle for politics. In Benedict XVI's exhortation to the Church in Africa, he declares that reconciliation is a pre-political reality, and then goes on to establish its relevance for political orders. In Christianity, of course, reconciliation means above all God's reconciliation of the world to himself through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This vertical reconciliation, as it might be called, makes possible a horizontal reconciliation between humans. In the New Testament, reconciliation can be understood as a process of restoring relationship and as a resulting state of right relationship. Pivotal for the argument at hand is the convergence between the Bible's conception of reconciliation and its concept of justice, which translates a comprehensive right relationship, understood both as a state and as a process of restoration. On biblical grounds, then, we can say that reconciliation is a concept of justice, the justice of right relationship. That reconciliation would be a concept of justice may well grate in the ears of Westerners, for whom justice is a matter of rights and perhaps deserve punishment. Reconciliation, by contrast, includes rights, which are indeed a dimension of right relationship, but also includes other goods and practices that achieve right relationship. Reconciliation is not only a concept of justice, but also converges with two other concepts in the biblical text, peace and mercy. Peace, denoted by shalom and irene, is a condition of comprehensive right relationship in a community, and thus corresponds to the sense in which reconciliation is a state of right relationship. Mercy in the Bible is far broader than the contemporary Western notion, which is a release from deserved punishment. It involves a will to restore all that is broken, and thus corresponds to the sense in which reconciliation is a process of restoring relationship. Reconciliation is found not only in the meaning of biblical concepts, but also in the restorative action of God, embodied most fully for Catholics in the Eucharist. Herein lies an important difference between reconciliation and the vision of Pacem and Terris. Pacem and Terris is largely rooted in natural law and the presence of the image of God in the person, which is the basis of human dignity. Reconciliation, by contrast, centers on the intervention of God, the acts of God in human history. How is reconciliation to be realized, though, in modern political orders? How do we bring this theology down to earth? Well, first, what I am advocating is political reconciliation, that which pertains to people's relationship as citizens in the political order, not comprehensive reconciliation, which pertains to the entire set of their relationships. Crucial to enacting the justice of reconciliation in political orders are the two concepts of wounds and practices. Although political violence, by which I mean war, genocide, the injustices of dictatorships, and so forth, violates human rights, the ways in which it wounds persons' relationships in political orders are far wider than what rights alone describe. The wounds also include the whole range of harms to victims, including the loss of family members and economic livelihood, permanent injury, sexual assault, victims' lack of knowledge of the source and circumstances of their violence, lack of public acknowledgement of victim suffering, what I call the standing victory of the political injustice, and even the harm to the soul of the perpetrator himself. It is then 6 practices that enact the ethic by aiming to transform wounded persons and relationships to a condition of greater flourishing. The first practice is building regimes based on human rights and building relations between states based on respect for international law. This practice is indispensable, although it's a very widely construed one, if reconciliation is not to be cheap, taking the form of an amnesty, an agreement between enemies, or an otherwise negative peace that does not involve justice for all. Second, acknowledgement of the suffering of victims on the part of other citizens in the political community is the second practice. Conferring acknowledgement are truth commissions, over 40 of which have taken place around the world in the past generation, as well as museums, monuments, commemorations, and rituals of remembrance. Theologically, acknowledgement reflects God's own remembrance and recognition of the poor, the victim, and the forgotten, and his will for their restoration, as recorded through the Bible and realized in Christ. A third practice is reparations, a material payment to political victims of injustices on the part of the state, usually, The purpose is to compensate them in part for the material loss, but also to express a symbolic recognition, to achieve acknowledgement. Fourth is punishment. Debates about just responses to past evil around the world frequently pit reconciliation against punishment. Critics of reconciliation equate reconciliation with amnesty and thus reject it. An ethic of reconciliation, though, need not exclude punishment and can, in fact, justify it on a restorative rationale. Indeed, if you look at the Catechism, it says that the chief purpose of punishment is to redress the disorder caused by an offense. I see that as a restorative rationale, promoting the restoration of relationships between perpetrators, victims, and members of the community. Punishment is the fourth practice. Church teaching, at least since Aquinas, I believe, has taught the restorative purpose of a punishment. Aquinas called it medicinal. Restorative punishment is realized most fully in community forums, where victims, perpetrators, and community members gather in a common place and recite their stories and their claims, and where community elders deliver a penance that takes the form of restitution or reintegrative community service. Apology, a fifth practice, is growing increasingly common in global politics. A succession of German leaders, for instance, has voiced repentance for the Nazis' perpetration of the Holocaust. In practicing apology, a perpetrator nullifies the standing victory of his injustice, commits himself to the restoration of his own soul, if he's the one who committed the injustice, and confers recognition on victims. When a leader of a nation or other collective performs an apology, he speaks on behalf of the political community in whose name the injustice was committed, though the leader may not himself have been involved in the act of injustice. In Christian theology, repentance, confession, and apology are essential for the moral and spiritual restoration of a perpetrator and his appropriation of forgiveness. Forgiveness, the sixth practice, is the most rare of the six practices to take place in political orders, but also the most distinctively Christian, and I would argue the most potentially transforming. It is also the one that gets the least attention and perhaps the most criticism from the international community. South Africa's Nelson Mandela is one of the few heads of states to have practiced it, though accounts of the aftermath of violence in countries like South Africa, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and Uganda reveal that victims have practiced it as well. In a robust Christian theological framework, forgiveness involves not only the victim's renunciation of resentment, but also her construction of right relationship. Most vividly of the six practices, forgiveness expresses the mercy and the justice that wills to restore relationship, and it helps to restore just peace in political orders. Now, to speak of reconciliation, peace, and forgiveness in sites of massive past political injustices may well sound utopian. It is worth stressing that all six practices, wherever they take place, will remain partially accomplished, compromised by power, hindered by differing concepts of justice among victims, perpetrators, and other citizens, laden with sheer complexity, and hampered by political institutions that have often been wrecked and then repaired only partially, if at all. Pertinent to an ethic of political reconciliation is another theological concept, yes, Gene, original sin, which reminds us that the work of restoration will be accomplished in partial and fragmentary ways this side of heaven. To conceive of justice and peace holistically is not to insist that peace and justice will be achieved holistically in the political realm. In part, the function of an ethic of political reconciliation is to provide standards according to which we can assess efforts. Still, though, the ethic of political reconciliation is not an ethic of mere ideals. In the real world, all six of the practices do occur, even if roughly. In these occurrences, we can find a mixture of breakdown and breakthrough. The resulting predicament is that the restorative practices take place, but are suffused with blemish. It is just this predicament that begs an ethic. Were the practices ineffectual, the ethic would be futile. If the practices did not involve partiality, compromise, and excruciating dilemmas, the ethic would be pointless. In my view, the ethic is not only not pointless, but is also urgent given the reparative task faced so widely. Its conception of this reparation builds on the commitments of Pacem and Terris, but also extends them, aspiring to be what John Henry Newman and later the magisterium of the church itself called a doctrinal development, reform and continuity. Thank you.